Hello, Miss Curdy here, and I want to talk to you today about area and perimeter. I am here with my producer, Carl. Carl, say hi to everybody. He's thrilled. All right, so let's talk about area and perimeter. Before we do that, I want to review multiplication a little bit. In September, we learned that multiplication means groups of. So if we were to solve a problem like 3 times 8, we can think of it as 3 groups of 8. We can use repeated addition to solve that if we don't have our facts memorized yet. You better keep practicing. For 3 times 8, we can use repeated addition, and we can add 8 plus 8 plus 8 to give us a total of 24. This is going to be really useful when we start talking about area, because area is a lot like multiplication. We've also talked about arrays, where you would have array to help you solve a multiplication problem. So again, with that 3 times 8, we can use an array and make 3 rows of 8, and then count each of those images that we made in those rows and columns. Not a very efficient way to do it, but that is one way to solve those problems. This array relates a lot to area. So take a look at this image. Here I've made an array that is 3 rows of 8. And to solve that, again, I can do 8 plus 8 plus 8 to get me a total of 24. When we start talking about area, you are going to be seeing shapes that look a lot like this or like this. The definition of area is the amount of unit squares it takes to cover a shape. Sometimes we call that tiling because it looks just like floor tiles. So if you have any tiling in your house, take a look at them because some of them may be squares, and you can actually find the area by counting those square tiles. In this case, we have 3 rows of 8, and we would need to find out how many tiles it would take to cover this figure. And again, if we know our facts, we can just do 3 times 8 to get us 24. If we're not so good with them, we can use our repeated addition, just like we did up here, or we can actually go in and count individual shapes. For smaller shapes, that's not too big of a challenge, but when we get to shapes that are like 8 rows of 9 or 9 rows of 10, that would be a lot of extra counting and a lot of time that we would take for that. As we progress through the unit, you're going to start seeing shapes that look like this. It's more simplified than a shape like this, where instead of drawing all of those tiles in there, we can just label the dimensions. The dimensions are the width and the length, and in this case, we have a 3 by 8. That's how we can label these figures as well, calling them a 3 by 8. And again, to find the area, I can think of it as an array, and instead of having to draw in all the square tiles, I can just multiply 3 times 8 to give me an area of 12. So remember, area is the number of unit squares it takes to cover a shape. And now we can call them unit squares if they don't have a specific dimension labeled, or we can call them whatever they may be labeled. So for example, sometimes you might say 3 inches by 8 inches, or 3 miles by 8 miles, or 3 centimeters by 8 centimeters, and in that case, our label would be labeled the same. When we label area, though, because we're talking about square units, because we're talking about how many squares it takes, we would label it as square units. So if you take a look, this would be labeled as 24 square units. Now, when we talk about perimeter, perimeter is really related to area in many ways because they are often talked about together. Area is the number of square tiles inside a shape, but perimeter would be the distance around a figure. In order to find the perimeter, all we need to do is add up all the sides. Remember, most often your rectangles or your squares are just going to be labeled on 2 sides, but when we add them up, we want to make sure that we remember the opposite sides. And from our geometry unit, we know that in a rectangle, the opposite sides are equal. So if the top here is 8, the bottom would be 8 as well. And if this side is 3, our opposite side would be 3. So in order to find the perimeter, we would do 3 plus 8 plus 3 plus 8, which would be 11 plus 11 to get us a total of 22. As you become more sophisticated, you may look at this and just say, okay, 8 plus 3 is 11, and I know this opposite side is going to be the same, so I can just add those two together and then multiply by 2. So 11 times 2 would also get us to that answer of 22. And we would label it as 22 units. Area is square units, perimeter is just regular units. Some of you may be sitting there going, oh, when am I ever going to need to know this in real life? Area and perimeter is something you will use often. Here are some real life applications of that. Let's say you get a puppy and you're trying to plan out how much fencing you want to use. Well, fencing would be a perimeter problem. You would need to know the perimeter of your yard or the area you're trying to fence off, and then you'd need to use that perimeter to go to Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you're going to go shopping and let them know how much fencing you need. Also, when you're putting up the fencing, you want to be thinking about the area your space would have, your dog would have to run around. The longer and thinner your shape, the less area that dog will have. And the closer your shape looks like to a square, the larger the area is going to have. So that's just one example. If you're painting walls, you would need to know area. If you're doing tiling, of course, you would need to know area. Any type of fencing, anytime you're putting borders around crafts that you might be making, you would need to know the perimeter of those figures. Just a quick review. Multiplication is used a lot in area, and the arrays that we used to do in September will help you a lot when finding the area. Area is the square number of square units used to cover a figure, and if you multiply your length by your width or your rows by your columns, that's a quicker, more efficient way to find your area. Or you can resort back to counting the individual squares. Sometimes you'll see rectangles where the squares are not filled in, and you just need to multiply your length times your width to get your area. Remember to always label it as square units. Perimeter is the distance around the outside of a figure, and to find that, you would add up all the side lengths, either doing the 3 plus 8 plus 3 plus 8 to get you your 22, or doing 8 plus 3 is 11, and then multiplying that times 2 because you know you're going to double that amount. Please look for more videos on area and perimeter, and let me in class know if you need any more help. That is all for today. Let's check in with our producer. Anything to add? All right, thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.